It is the early 1990s in a federal courtroom in Chicago. On the witness stand sits an elderly man in a plain jacket, his white hair neatly combed, his glasses slipping a little on the bridge of his nose. To an uninformed observer, he looks like a retired shopkeeper, or perhaps someone's grandfather waiting patiently at a doctor's office. Yet the room around him is charged with a tension that has been building in the city for more than half a century. Prosecutors lean in over their files. Reporters clutch their notebooks, aware that they are watching something unprecedented. Across the aisle, men who once moved through Chicago's underworld with quiet authority stare straight ahead, trying hard not to look at the man on the stand. The name on the indictment and on the lips of almost everyone in that room is Leonard, Lenny Patrick. For decades, Patrick had been one of those figures who almost never appeared in public yet whose influence was felt in neighborhoods, businesses, and political offices across the city. He had passed through the Prohibition years, the bloody gang wars, the restructuring of the old bootlegging empires into what became known as the Chicago outfit. He had seen bosses rise and fall, and he had survived. Now, in his late 70s, he was doing what almost no one in his position had ever done. He was testifying against his own. The prosecutors wanted him to lift the veil on a lifetime in organized crime. The defense feared what he might confirm about extortion, threats, and the quiet pressure that for years had weighed on shopkeepers and bookmakers and businessmen all over Chicago. To understand how this unremarkable-looking man became both a feared underworld figure and, eventually, the government's star witness, we have to go back many decades, to a different Chicago and a very different Lenny Patrick. When Leonard Patrick was born in 1913, Chicago was a city still coming to terms with its own explosive growth. In the half-century after the Civil War, Chicago had gone from a rough Midwestern town to one of the largest cities in the United States. Railroads converged here. Stockyards processed millions of animals each year. Steel mills, factories, and warehouses stretched for miles across the flat landscape. The air smelled of coal smoke and meatpacking plants, a mix that visitors found overwhelming, but that residents simply called home. This booming industrial machine was powered by human beings who, like Patrick's parents, had come from somewhere else. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe streamed into American cities, including Chicago. They fled anti-Semitic laws, political instability, and episodes of mob violence in the Russian Empire and neighboring regions. Steamships brought them to the East Coast. Trains carried many of them onward to the Midwest. Chicago, with its reputation for opportunity and its existing Jewish communities, was a logical destination. They arrived with little money, often speaking Yiddish and perhaps a few words of English, and settled in crowded neighborhoods where rents were low and familiar faces were nearby. Patrick's family was part of that wave. They were one among many Jewish families squeezed into the dense tenement blocks of the city's west side, in streets not far from the open-air markets that fed the area's working poor. Families like theirs typically lived in small apartments with thin walls and shared bathrooms, a world of coal stoves, shared courtyards, and constant noise. Religious life revolved around corner synagogues and small study houses. Economic life centered on the market streets, where peddlers sold everything from used shoes to fresh vegetables. Most adults in these communities worked in garment shops, small factories, pushcart stalls, or tiny family stores. Long hours and low wages were the norm. This was the environment into which Lenny Patrick opened his eyes. Precise details of his very earliest years are sparse. He was not yet the kind of person whose life would be carefully documented. But we know enough about the world around him to understand the pressures that shaped him. Children in his neighborhood grew up quickly. They helped parents with work, ran errands, and navigated streets that were crowded, vibrant, and sometimes dangerous. They learned to switch between languages, Yiddish or another Eastern European tongue at home, English in the streets and at school. They also learned, often at an early age, where they stood in the city's pecking order. Chicago in those years was sharply divided by ethnicity, religion, and class. Neighborhoods were organized not only by where people could afford to live, but by where they were allowed to live. Restrictive covenants and informal agreements kept many immigrants and people of color out of certain areas. Irish, Germans, Italians, Poles, African Americans arriving from the South, Jews from Europe. Each group had enclaves, institutions, and tensions with their neighbors. For Jewish immigrants like the Patricks, antisemitism was not just something they had fled in Europe. It existed in subtler but still painful forms in America. Name-calling in the schoolyard, hearing discrimination and exclusion from clubs and professions reminded them that they were outsiders even here. At the same time, there were real opportunities. Chicago's economy was growing, and for hardworking families with a bit of luck, there was a path, however narrow, from sweatshop work to owning a small business, from the tenements to slightly better housing. This mix of hardship and hope formed the backdrop of Patrick's childhood. He would have seen relatives and neighbors working themselves to exhaustion to keep a roof over their heads. He would also have seen other neighbors, those not inclined or able to follow the official paths to success, look for shortcuts. The streets where Patrick grew up were full of informal economies. There were legitimate vendors and laborers, but also gamblers, unlicensed peddlers, and a small but noticeable number of outright thieves. In crowded marketplaces, pickpockets worked the edges of the throngs. Young boys ran errands for a few coins, sometimes for shopkeepers, sometimes for less respectable figures. Police patrols were uneven. Some officers turned a blind eye in exchange for small payments or favors. This was not yet the sophisticated world of the modern Chicago outfit, but the seeds of that world were already in the soil. As Patrick moved from early childhood into boyhood, the city shifted around him. World War I drew young men into military service and brought new jobs to factories filling government contracts. The war's end in 1918 left many of those same workers uncertain about their future. In 1919, Chicago was shaken by a violent race riot that laid bare the city's deep tensions over race, housing, and employment. Patrick would have been a child then, old enough to hear adults talk in frightened or angry tones about what was happening, and to understand that violence was a tool used not only by individuals, but by groups asserting power over others. At home and at school, he absorbed the values and expectations of his community: respect for family, the importance of work, religious traditions that offered solace and identity. But outside, on street corners and in alleys, he encountered another set of lessons about how power worked in practice. Boys formed groups, neighborhood gangs, in the older sense of the word, more for protection and belonging than for serious crime at first. These groups often aligned along ethnic lines. Irish boys from one stretch of streets, Italian boys from another, Jewish boys from a cluster of blocks nearby. They fought over turf, but they also shared information about where a person could make some quick money, or which adult was willing to pay them to look the other way. In 1920, when Patrick was still a child, the United States government enacted national prohibition, banning the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages. The law was celebrated by temperance advocates, but in cities like Chicago it had an immediate and perhaps predictable effect. Demand for alcohol did not vanish. It simply went underground. Men who had already been dabbling in vice, running gambling games, operating brothels, saw a massive new opportunity. They organized smuggling networks, distribution systems, and enforcement squads. Politicians and police officers, some of whom were already corrupt, became deeply entangled in these operations. Chicago became notorious for its bootleggers and gangsters. Names like Johnny Torrio and Al Capone entered the newspapers and, in a perverse way, popular culture. But behind the famous Italian bosses stood networks that were ethnically mixed. There were Irish policemen on the take, politicians of various backgrounds, and Jewish figures who handled finances, distribution, and neighborhoods where Italian gangsters had less access. For a boy like Patrick, walking through his West Side streets, the presence of organized crime was not an abstraction. He would have seen the nicer cars driven by men who didn't seem to have regular jobs, heard the gossip about which speakeasy was backed by which crew, and understood that the line between legal and illegal enterprise was not as clear as schoolteachers might suggest. Still, the vast majority of people in his community stayed on the legal side of that line. They worked, saved, sent their children to public schools, and hoped for advancement. Many of Patrick's peers followed that path. What separated those who did from those who didn't was a combination of temperament, opportunity, personal decisions, and sheer luck. The documentary record on Patrick's adolescent years is thinner than on his later life. But by the time he began to appear in police and investigative files as an adult, he had already chosen a direction that placed him firmly on the edges of legality. It is likely that his formal education was limited. In working-class families, children often left school early to contribute to the household income. Even for those who stayed, overcrowded classrooms and underfunded schools made it difficult to receive the kind of education that opened doors to white-collar work. By his mid-teens, Patrick was spending most of his time not in a classroom but on the streets, and in the kinds of establishments that catered to young men of modest means. Pool halls, cheap cafes, and corner stores with back rooms where dice rattled and small bets were made. These were not inherently criminal spaces, but they were places where the boundaries between legitimate hustle and criminal enterprise were porous. Youth gangs in Chicago evolved alongside the maturing world of organized crime. What started as loose-knit neighborhood groups of boys looking out for one another became, in some cases, feeder systems for more serious organizations. Older gang members introduced promising youngsters to jobs running messages, acting as lookouts, or helping to move contraband. For someone like Patrick, who had grown up watching the swagger and apparent independence of local toughs, this attention could be flattering and financially rewarding. A few coins for a simple task might equal what a parent earned in hours of honest labor. The late 1920s brought both prosperity and instability. Chicago saw an influx of money, some of it from legitimate commerce, some from illegal liquor and associated rackets. At the same time, the city endured high-profile episodes of gang violence, which drew national attention and increased pressure from law enforcement. Patrick would have been a teenager as these stories unfolded, old enough to understand what they meant, old enough to see that the men who survived repeated clashes with rivals and police did so because they were ruthless, disciplined, and deeply embedded in systems of corruption. Then, in 1929, the stock market crash signaled the start of the Great Depression. For communities like the one in which Patrick grew up, the effects were swift and harsh. Factories closed or reduced shifts. Wages dropped. Families that had been on the edge of poverty found themselves unable to pay rent or buy enough food. Charitable organizations and mutual aid societies tried to fill the gaps, but their resources were limited. In this atmosphere, the appeal of any reliable source of income, legal or not, grew stronger. Criminal enterprises adapted. With less money circulating, some forms of vice declined, but others, especially those that targeted the small but steady cash flows of businesses and workers, became more important. Loan sharking, protection rackets, and small-scale gambling offered both temptation and, for those on the other side of the transaction, peril. Neighborhood gangs that survived the Depression did so by attaching themselves more closely to larger organizations and by diversifying their activities. The Chicago outfit, emerging from the old Prohibition-era structures, began to look less like a chaotic collection of competing gangs and more like a business with divisions and managers. As the 1930s began, Leonard Patrick was no longer just an immigrant's son in a crowded tenement. He was a young man in his late teens and early 20s, navigating a city where the old ethnic boundaries still mattered, but where money and muscle could sometimes bridge them. By this point, Law enforcement files would later show he was no longer merely on the periphery of small-time street life. He had crossed into a more serious and organized world of crime, taking part in activities that brought him under the watchful eye of police and, eventually, federal authorities. The boy who had grown up amid pushcarts and prayer houses was on the path to becoming one of Chicago's most enduring underworld figures, a path shaped by poverty, discrimination, urban change, and his own choices in a city where legitimate and illegitimate power were often closely intertwined. The earliest clear glimpse of Leonard Patrick in the official record comes in the early 1930s, when Chicago was trying to redefine itself after a decade of prohibition. The country was in the grip of the Great Depression. Men lined up at relief offices and soup kitchens. Newspapers ran photographs of families forced out of their homes, and factory whistles that once signaled shifts now blew only occasionally. Prohibition, the grand national experiment, was coming apart. Enforcement had always been inconsistent, and in Chicago it had been openly undermined by underpaid officers, elected officials on the take, and a population that often saw drinking as a personal choice rather than a moral issue. By 1933, when the repeal movement swept away the ban on alcohol, organized crime faces that had grown famous in the 1920s were household names. But the men behind those faces were already thinking ahead. For the Chicago underworld, the end of prohibition did not mean going out of business. It meant reorganizing. The lessons learned running bootleg liquor operations, coordinating suppliers and distributors, corrupting officials, managing money, and using fear when necessary, could be applied to other ventures. Gambling, extortion, labor racketeering, and control over certain unions and businesses were the new pillars. The loosely connected gangs of the 1920s coalesced into a more centralized entity that law enforcement and journalists came to call the Chicago Outfit. Patrick was in his late teens and early 20s as this transformation took place. He had already been drawn into the gray area between legal hustle and outright crime. Police notes and later court testimony, while not exhaustive, suggest that his early offenses were typical of a certain kind of urban youth in that era. Small-time thefts, involvement in dice or card games that skirted the law, and association with other young men who made a living on the streets. In West Side neighborhoods like Lawndale, where Jewish immigrant families like his had settled, these activities were not unusual themes in hushed adult conversations and adolescent bravado. What set Patrick apart was not that he dabbled in such things, but that he persisted and escalated. Before long, his name began to appear more regularly in local police logs as a suspect or associate in more serious incidents. Sources from later investigations, including interviews conducted when he was an old man, indicate that he was drawn toward armed robbery, an offense that, in the 1930s, occupied a central place in the criminal ecosystem. Banks and payroll deliveries were tempting targets in a cash-based economy, especially in a time when economic hardship made the sight of bundled currency almost magnetic to those with few legitimate prospects. Armed robbery was also, from the perspective of authorities, a serious and public menace. It frightened middle-class citizens, burdened insurance companies, and was easy for politicians to condemn. Chicago's newspapers regularly printed stories about holdups at small banks or corner stores, the headlines framed in language that portrayed the perpetrators as reckless threats to order. Those who planned and carried out such crimes took significant risks. Police attention was intense, and a conviction could bring long prison sentences. Nevertheless, men with Patrick's temperament, calculated rather than impulsive, according to those who later observed him closely, sometimes viewed robbery as a way to prove their worth to more established underworld figures. Sometime in these early Depression years, Patrick crossed a threshold. Instead of simply running errands or acting as a lookout, he took part in robberies himself. The details of each individual crime are scattered across aging law enforcement files and are not always complete, but the pattern is clear. In his early 20s, he was no longer a peripheral figure. He was an active participant in offenses that involved planning, weapons, and the willingness to confront victims directly. For a young man who had grown up seeing the imbalance between how hard his parents worked and how little they were paid, the sudden influx of cash from a successful robbery must have felt like a stark alternative to the grinding routine of legal work. The turning point came when one of these operations went wrong from his perspective, and right from that of the law. Arrested in connection with a significant robbery, accounts vary as to whether it was a bank or a business handling large sums of cash. Patrick faced the full weight of the criminal justice system. Unlike minor charges that could be pleaded down, dismissed, or handled quietly with the help of a friendly lawyer and a cooperative police officer, this was a case that prosecutors wanted to make an example of. A conviction could demonstrate that the state was serious about protecting property and punishing those who threatened it. In court, Patrick's background as the son of immigrants, his youth, and any past minor brushes with the law would have been considered alongside the severity of the offense. Judges in that era were often unsympathetic to repeat offenders, especially those associated in any way with the growing mythology of gangsters. The sentence he received reflected that attitude. He was sent away for a substantial stretch, years rather than months. This was no short county jail term. It meant time in a state or federal penitentiary, removed from his neighborhood and his family. Prison in the 1930s was a harsh environment, though the most extreme conditions were not always visible to the public. Overcrowding, minimal rehabilitation programs, and a culture that mixed hardened criminals with less experienced offenders made it, in the words of some criminologists of the time, a school for crime. For someone like Patrick, already inclined toward illicit activity, incarceration could function less as a deterrent and more as an education. Within the walls, he encountered men whose criminal resumes were more extensive than his own. Seasoned bank robbers, professional thieves, and, increasingly, individuals with direct ties to organized crime syndicates operating in Chicago, New York, and other major cities. These encounters mattered. In the hierarchical world of crime, prison served as a sorting mechanism. Those who demonstrated self-control, reliability, and the ability to keep quiet under pressure earned respect. Those who talked too freely or acted unpredictably were marginalized. Patrick, by most later accounts, fell into the former category. He was not flashy, did not seek attention, and understood the importance of discretion. Traits that had once helped him navigate the complexities of his West Side childhood now helped him survive and gain a measure of status behind bars. Over the years he spent incarcerated, the outside world changed dramatically. The repeal of prohibition in 1933 completed the legal transition that had already begun, but the underworld adapted effectively. The Chicago outfit, under leaders who followed Capone like Frank Nitti, Paul the Waiter Ricca, and Tony Accardo, shifted its primary focus to gambling, both legal fronts like horse racing and illegal bookmaking, as well as extortion and control of unions, especially in construction and transportation. Corruption remained a key tool. Judges, police officers, and politicians who cooperated could expect quiet benefits, those who did not risk harassment or worse. At the same time, the Great Depression continued to grind on. When Patrick entered prison, unemployment was high. When he eventually emerged, the economy had been reshaped by New Deal programs and, increasingly, by the demands of World War II. Chicago's factories roared back to life, producing machinery, weapons, and supplies for the war effort. Men who might otherwise have drifted into the orbit of local gangs found steady work in defense plants or enlisted in the military. Yet organized crime was hardly swept aside by patriotism. Indeed, wartime black markets in rationed goods, as well as continued gambling and vice, provided new opportunities. The outfit's leadership, many of whom were exempt from military service or beyond typical draft age, maintained and in some areas expanded their influence. When Patrick was finally released from prison, sources differ slightly on the exact year, but place it in the early to mid-1940s. He stepped back into a city both familiar and transformed. The West Side neighborhoods of his youth still held many of the same tenements and small shops, but there were now war bond posters in windows and young men in uniform on the streets. Many of his childhood peers had taken different paths. Some had gone straight, taking factory or clerical jobs. Some had moved to other parts of the city or country. Some had been pulled into the war. He returned, however, with a different kind of experience and a different set of connections. In prison, he had established contact with individuals linked more tightly to the upper tiers of the outfit. These were not necessarily bosses themselves, but men trusted by the leadership to handle certain territories or operations. Among them were figures who recognized the strategic value of someone like Patrick, a Jewish gangster from the West Side who could move comfortably in that community, understand its language and customs, and serve as a bridge between the Italian-dominated core of the outfit and Jewish gamblers, bookmakers, and business owners. Chicago's underworld had long been multi-ethnic. Jewish gangsters had played important roles since the days when Dion O'Banion's North Side Gang, which included the Polish-born, Jewish-raised Jaime Weiss, fought Capone's South Side Italians. Though those violent turf wars were largely over, the need for trusted intermediaries remained. Patrick's post-prison trajectory shows that he filled this niche. Rather than immediately returning to crude armed robbery, he moved into rackets that demanded more organization and in some ways more subtlety. Gambling was foremost among these. In mid-century Chicago, betting was everywhere on horse races, sports, cards, and numbers games. Much of it was technically illegal, but it operated in a semi-open fashion in many neighborhoods. Back rooms of taverns and storefronts doubled as betting parlors. Runners collected wagers and delivered them to wire rooms, where odds were managed and payouts calculated. The outfit did not necessarily run every game directly, but it expected a share of profits from anyone operating in its territory, and it provided protection in return. This protection was not a formal contract written on paper. It was an understanding, backed by reputation, and when necessary, by the possibility of property damage or personal harm. Patrick's role, as it evolved through the late 1940s, was to oversee certain sections of this system on behalf of more senior outfit figures. He collected payments, settled disputes, and ensured that those under his informal authority remembered who ultimately controlled the territory. His manner, as described by later informants and surveillance reports, was often calm and unassuming. He preferred conversation to open threats, but the men he dealt with understood that defiance could have serious consequences, even if Patrick himself rarely needed to spell them out. He also became involved in loan sharking, another pillar of outfit revenue. In working-class neighborhoods, access to legitimate credit was limited. Banks were wary of lending to individuals with unstable incomes, little collateral, or immigrant backgrounds. For people facing temporary financial crises, a medical bill, a bounced check, money lost at the track, the underworld offered an alternative. Loans were quick, but the interest rates were high and enforcement of repayment strict. Patrick, operating in neighborhoods where he was known, could present these arrangements as pragmatic solutions. Behind the veneer of a friend helping a friend stood a network that did not hesitate to apply pressure. Through this period, the Chicago Police Department and, increasingly, federal agencies kept files on men like Patrick. Yet law enforcement faced significant obstacles. Witnesses were reluctant to testify against outfit figures, fearing reprisal or simply doubting that the system would protect them. Corruption remained a problem. Not every officer or official who received an envelope of cash or a favor in return for looking the other way considered themselves part of the mob, but their willingness to be lenient reinforced the outfit's power. As a result, Patrick's name might appear in reports, mentioned as being seen in the company of known gangsters, suspected of involvement in certain operations, but solid, prosecutable cases were rare during these years. This relative security allowed him to embed himself further. By the late 1940s, he was no longer just a West Side kid who'd gone wrong, as some might have described him earlier. He was an established mid-level operator in the Chicago outfit's broader structure. Those above him trusted him to manage profitable but sensitive activities. Those below him saw him as the conduit through which approval money, and when necessary, discipline flowed. His Jewish background and neighborhood roots gave him credibility in communities that might otherwise have been wary of direct Italian control. In parallel, the broader Jewish community in Chicago was changing. Many families who had arrived in the early 20th century were now moving, slowly and unevenly, into the middle class. Children went to college in greater numbers. Some relocated from cramped West Side tenements to slightly better housing on the North Side or in nearby suburbs. Synagogues, community centers, and civic organizations encouraged integration into mainstream American life. In this context, Jewish involvement in organized crime became increasingly uncomfortable for community leaders. They feared that the actions of people like Patrick would reinforce stereotypes that had long been used against Jews in both Europe and America, that they were involved in finance and manipulation in underhanded ways. Publicly, respectable Jewish organizations condemned gangsterism. Privately, some individuals, especially small business owners, continued to deal with men like Patrick out of necessity or perceived necessity. If you ran a bar, a small factory, or a gambling operation on the west or north sides, ignoring the outfit's representatives was risky. In this ambiguous space, Patrick operated with a mixture of familiarity and distance. He could talk sports or neighborhood gossip with people who had known him for decades, while simultaneously representing a criminal organization that had very clear expectations about loyalty and payment. The late 1940s also saw the rise of new law enforcement efforts to counter organized crime nationally. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, had for years focused primarily on bank robbers, kidnappers, and political threats, often downplaying the existence of coordinated criminal syndicates. But local and state agencies, along with independent groups like the Chicago Crime Commission, increasingly documented patterns that pointed beyond individual crimes. They mapped networks of relationships, tracked money flows, and compiled lists of suspected mobsters. Leonard "Lenny," Patrick's name, often associated with gambling and extortion on the city's north and west sides, appeared in these files with growing frequency. Yet despite this, he remained largely a shadowy figure to the broader public. Unlike flamboyant gangsters of earlier decades, he did not seek the spotlight or cultivate a public persona. He avoided ostentatious displays of wealth that might draw attention. To neighbors, he could appear as a somewhat quiet, even ordinary man who always seemed to have cash on hand and who knew how to get things done. The full significance of his role, his decades-long service within the outfit, and the decisions he made that affected countless lives, would only come into focus much later, when he broke with the code of silence that had protected him and others for so long. For now, as the 1940s rolled into the 1950s, he was still moving upward within the underworld, consolidating his authority and adjusting to new alliances and rivalries in a city that remained, beneath its surface, deeply shaped by organized crime. By the middle of the 20th century, Chicago was presenting a new face to the world. War industries had given way to peacetime production, and a growing middle class was buying cars, moving to bungalows on the northwest and southwest sides, or even out into the suburbs. The city promoted itself as a modern metropolis of gleaming office towers and orderly neighborhoods. Yet beneath that surface, the machinery of organized crime continued to turn, more quietly than in the days of Tommy guns and headline-grabbing massacres, but no less effectively. Within this hidden system, Leonard "Lenny" Patrick had become a fixture. He was no longer the reckless young robber who had gone off to prison years earlier. Those who dealt with him in the late 1940s and early 1950s encountered a man who understood both the value of routine and the power of reputation. He dressed conservatively, spoke in a low, measured tone, and rarely raised his voice. But in the neighborhoods where he operated, his name carried weight. Behind that calm exterior was a well-earned understanding of how the Chicago outfit worked after Prohibition, who gave orders, who collected money, and how disputes were resolved without drawing unwanted attention. Structurally, the outfit in this period was undergoing its own evolution. After the fall of Al Capone and the quiet ascent of figures like Frank Nitti, Paul Ricca, and Tony Accardo, the organization's Italian leadership made a conscious effort to lower its public profile. Instead of flamboyant displays of wealth and open warfare in the streets, the guiding strategy was to blend into the city's legitimate business world. Bosses took stakes in nightclubs, construction firms, trucking companies, and other enterprises. Day-to-day enforcement and collections in various neighborhoods were delegated to trusted lieutenants, many of whom, like Patrick, shared ethnic or social ties with the communities they would dominate. For Patrick, this meant that his role as a Jewish gangster on the city's north and west sides became more formally defined. The outfit did not publish organizational charts, but law enforcement intelligence assembled over time, and later testimony, makes clear that Chicago's Italian bosses relied heavily on a network of non-Italian associates. Among the most important of these was a Greek-American named Gus Alex, who would become one of the key figures in Patrick's life. Alex functioned as a bridge between the outfit and the world of politics and business in downtown Chicago, the Loop. He cultivated relationships with local officials, businessmen, and labor figures, and he managed extortion schemes that targeted lucrative enterprises. Patrick's own territory, centered more in residential and commercial districts with significant Jewish populations, fit neatly alongside Alex's. In the early 1950s, the United States Senate brought organized crime into the national spotlight through a series of televised hearings headed by Senator Est Kefauver. The Kefauver Committee held sessions in cities across the country, including Chicago, summoning witnesses ranging from gamblers and union officials to known gangsters. Some underworld figures appeared and flatly denied everything. Others invoked their constitutional right against self-incrimination and refused to answer questions. The hearings gave millions of Americans their first glimpse of how deeply organized crime had penetrated everyday life. Chicago's delegation, both mobsters and local officials, did not come out looking good. Patrick himself was not a star witness in those hearings, but the inquiries had consequences for him. Newspapers nomming rackets kings and top hoodlums in Chicago made his world less shadowy. The Chicago Crime Commission and similar watchdog groups compiled lists of suspected organized crime figures, drawing on police records, informant reports, and their own investigations. Patrick's name began to appear with some regularity in these compilations, typically associated with gambling and extortion in the city's north side and adjacent suburbs. While such listings did not constitute proof in court, they flagged him as a person of interest to local and federal agents who opened or expanded files in his name. At the same time, Patrick's practical responsibilities grew. Illegal betting was flourishing. Even as Las Vegas developed as a legal gambling destination, everyday Chicagoans continued to place wagers through local bookmakers. These operations were often modest: a tavern back room, a corner confectionery where a man behind the counter took numbers, bets alongside selling newspapers and cigarettes. But collectively, they generated enormous revenue. The outfit system depended on allowing independent bookmakers to operate so long as they paid a percentage of their take as tribute. Patrick's task was to make that system work smoothly in his area. In practice, this meant a routine of visits and collections. An outfit representative like Patrick, or someone working under him, would appear at a business known to host illegal betting. The conversation did not have to be explicit. Owners understood that their operation was tolerated because someone powerful allowed it. The unspoken expectation was that they would show their appreciation in cash. If a bookmaker fell behind in payments or tried to work under the table with a rival group, Patrick was the man who came to straighten things out. Former associates and law enforcement reports describe his style as understated but firm. He rarely, if ever, threatened people in dramatic language. He did not need to. His presence and the knowledge of who stood behind him conveyed enough. Beyond gambling, he supervised loan sharking arrangements that extended credit to individuals and small operators shut out of conventional bank loans. The mechanics were simple. A borrower in trouble, perhaps a bar owner with tax issues, a small businessman facing seasonal slowdowns, or a gambler who had lost heavily, would receive cash with few questions asked. In return, they had to make regular payments at interest rates far above anything allowed in the legitimate financial system. If they fell behind, they might first get a reminder, then a more insistent visit and, if necessary, escalating forms of pressure. Violence was a tool of last resort, but the awareness that it could be used was integral to maintaining discipline. This world of quiet compulsion coexisted with a more conventional side of Patrick's life. Like many mid-level mob figures in this period, he maintained a facade of normalcy. Accounts from neighbors and later investigative reporting suggest that he lived in relatively modest housing for much of his middle years, not in a mansion or on a lavish estate. He was seen attending family gatherings, eating in neighborhood restaurants, frequenting synagogues on major holidays, participating, at least on the surface, in the same communal rituals as law-abiding residents. To the uninitiated, he could appear as nothing more than a local businessman with a knack for staying comfortable through economic ups and downs. Behind that facade, however, he continued to deepen his relationship with senior outfit figures, especially Gus Alex. Law enforcement files from the 1950s and 1960s are full of references to meetings between known mobsters in diners, social clubs, and downtown offices. Surveillance teams and informants rarely caught the content of these conversations, but they saw enough to map patterns. Patrick and Alex appeared together often enough that investigators came to view them as a working pair. Alex as the outfit's chief link to certain political and downtown business interests. Patrick as his counterpart in the neighborhoods, where a combination of ethnic familiarity and criminal reputation was necessary to keep the money flowing. The broader Jewish community, especially its leadership, was increasingly uneasy with the fact that a handful of its members were prominent in organized crime. In the interwar years, figures like Mayor Lansky and Bugsy Siegel had drawn similar scrutiny in New York and elsewhere. After World War II and the revelation of the full horror of the Holocaust, many American Jewish organizations were especially sensitive to public image. They promoted stories of success in academia, business, and the professions, and they spoke out against anti-Semitism from both fringe extremists and more respectable quarters. The existence of someone like Patrick, known to police, whispered about in some neighborhoods, clashed with this aspirational narrative. Local rabbis and community leaders occasionally addressed the issue obliquely in sermons or public statements, denouncing those who bring shame on our people by pursuing dishonest gain. Such words were not aimed at Patrick by name, but the target was clear enough to anyone paying attention. For his part, there is no evidence that he paid these condemnations much heed. His loyalty lay not with communal respectability, but with the outfit and the system that had provided him a measure of power and security. If there was any internal conflict between his ethnic and religious heritage and his criminal occupation, it left little trace in the record. In the broader world of American law enforcement, the 1950s and 1960s were a time of slow, uneven adjustment to the reality of organized crime. For years, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had minimized the threat of coordinated criminal syndicates, focusing instead on bank robbers, kidnappers, and perceived political subversives. Local police departments, including Chicago's, were left to confront the outfit with limited resources and, in many cases, compromised personnel. Gradually, however, events forced a shift. The notorious 1957 gathering of national mob figures in Appalachian, New York, where dozens of gangsters were detained after state police stumbled upon their meeting, provided clear evidence that crime families across the country were in contact with one another, coordinating territories and strategies. In the wake of Appalachian, federal agencies began to take more seriously the idea of a national organized crime network. They compiled centralized lists of suspected members and associates, cross-referencing names mentioned in wiretaps, informant reports, and local arrest records. The Chicago outfit was recognized not as an isolated phenomenon, but as one family within a broader constellation of groups sometimes referred to as La Cosa Nostra. Patrick's name appeared in these indexes, typically tagged with notations like racketeer, gambling, North Side, and associate of Gus Alex. This did not immediately lead to prosecution. Proving specific crimes in court remained difficult, but it meant that he was now firmly within the sights of the national law enforcement apparatus. Meanwhile, Chicago itself was undergoing demographic shifts that were reshaping the map of Patrick's operations. In the years after the war, African American families moving from the rural South arrived in large numbers, settling first on the South Side, and later pushing westward into areas that had once been overwhelmingly European and Jewish. Many Jewish residents of the old West Side neighborhoods where Patrick had grown up moved north to communities like Albany Park, Rogers Park, and Skokie, or further into the suburbs. They brought their synagogues, delicatessens, and cultural institutions with them, recreating a version of the old neighborhood in new zip codes. Patrick's activities followed this migration. Law enforcement reports from the 1960s and 1970s place him increasingly in areas with growing Jewish and middle-class populations on the North Side and in nearby suburbs. While Italian outfit figures traditionally had a strong presence on the city's west and southwest sides, the network of bookmakers, small-time gamblers, and business owners in these northern districts was more naturally approached through someone like Patrick, whose background and long-standing relationships allowed him to move with ease. His territory was not a fixed block of streets, but a social geography defined by language, custom, and trust, albeit trust enforced by the understanding of what could happen to those who broke it. The 1960s also brought new tools for law enforcement. Congressional hearings and the testimony of defectors like New York mobster Joseph Valachi in 1963 pushed the federal government to invest more in specialized organized crime strike forces. These multi-agency teams brought together FBI agents, IRS investigators, and Justice Department attorneys to build complex cases that focus not just on individual acts of violence, but on patterns of extortion, illegal gambling, and tax evasion. Electronic surveillance, though subject to evolving legal constraints, became a critical technique. In Chicago, agents listening in on conversations in bars, restaurants, and private offices heard names like Lenny and Gus surface regularly in discussions of collections, payoffs, and territorial disputes. Transcripts from these wiretaps, later released in redacted form or summarized in court documents, reveal the tone of these conversations. Rather than dramatic declarations, they contain the language of business. How much was due, who had fallen behind, which store or guy needed a visit, which politician or police officer required attention before a vote or a raid. Patrick appears in this world as a steady presence, someone whose job was to ensure that the numbers added up and that smaller players understood the expectations. His temperament, cool, unspectacular, methodical, suited this work. Yet for all the attention from law enforcement, significant legal victories against him remained elusive through much of this period. He was sometimes arrested in gambling raids or called in for questioning when a business owner complained about threats, but charges were often reduced or dropped. Witnesses changed their stories, could not recall specifics, or declined to testify. Defense attorneys argued that their clients were simply businessmen or bettors caught up in overzealous investigations. Juries, wary of punishing people based on association rather than clear evidence, hesitated. The intimidation that hung over so many of Patrick's interactions was difficult to translate into courtroom proof. As he aged into his 40s and 50s, Patrick's position within the outfit stabilized. He was no longer a rising young enforcer proving himself, nor was he part of the top Italian leadership that made high-level decisions about alliances with other crime families or investments in distant ventures like Las Vegas casinos. He occupied the middle ground where much of the day-to-day work of organized crime actually occurred. Money moved through his hands. Orders flowed down to him and reports back up. He trained and supervised younger men who, like he once had, came from the streets of Chicago and saw in the outfit a path to fast cash and local influence. The political landscape of Chicago, dominated for decades by the Democratic machine built by Mayor Richard J. Daley, intersected with this underworld in complex ways. Daley's organization controlled city jobs, zoning decisions, and through patronage networks, the fortunes of many businesses. The outfit, for its part, needed cooperation or at least indifference from city departments to keep its gambling and extortion rackets running smoothly. Figures like Gus Alex were instrumental in managing these overlapping spheres. While Patrick himself did not stand in front of microphones or attend political events as a visible power broker, he benefited from, and occasionally facilitated, arrangements that ensured raids were infrequent, licenses were granted, and certain bets about city contracts and permits paid off as expected. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, as the United States was racked by social upheaval, civil rights protests, anti-war demonstrations, urban unrest, Patrick's world appeared on the surface almost static. The names of some bosses changed. New faces appeared among his subordinates. But the underlying pattern of his life remained much the same. Regular meetings, quiet collections, occasional brushes with the law that did not, at least yet, end in long prison sentences. Beneath that seeming stability, however, pressure was slowly building. Federal investigators were compiling thicker files, with better surveillance records and more cooperative witnesses. The legal framework for tackling organized crime was strengthening, especially with the passage of new laws aimed at dismantling criminal enterprises as a whole rather than chasing one case at a time. For Leonard "Lenny" Patrick, who had navigated the shifting landscape of Chicago's underworld for decades, the coming years would bring a new kind of challenge. The methods that had protected him, discretion, careful speech, reliance on fear rather than open violence, would be tested by more sophisticated, persistent law enforcement campaigns. The criminal career that had begun in the rough tenements of the West Side was heading toward a confrontation with a federal system determined, perhaps for the first time in his life, to hold him comprehensively accountable. In 1970, the United States Congress passed a law that would eventually change the way the government fought people like Leonard "Lenny" Patrick. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as RICO, gave federal prosecutors a new weapon. Instead of chasing one gambling case, one extortion, one fraudulent union contract at a time, they could now argue that repeated crimes were part of a larger pattern carried out by an enterprise. If they could show that someone had taken part in that pattern, even without pulling a trigger or signing every threatening note, that person could be held responsible for the organization's activities. In the early 1970s, when RICO was still just a new law on the books, Patrick was in his late 50s. He had already been in and around the Chicago underworld for more than 3 decades. The rough edges of his youth had worn down into an appearance of almost complete ordinariness. He was a compact, aging man, careful in his movements, dressed like any other small businessman of his generation. Yet around him, both his city and his world were shifting. Richard J. Daley still presided over City Hall, but the neighborhoods Patrick knew so well were not the same ones he had walked as a teenager. Old Jewish blocks on the west side were now largely African American. His own community had moved north and outward, into areas like Rogers Park, West Ridge, and the inner suburbs just beyond the city line. Many of the families who had left the tenements in the 1940s now owned small houses with lawns, sent their children to college, and measured success by distance from the crowded streets where they or their parents had started. Patrick followed that migration physically, if not morally. By the early 1970s, he was spending much of his time in and around the city's northern neighborhoods and nearby suburbs with growing Jewish and middle-class populations. He ate in their restaurants, visited their shops, and learned the new patterns of who owned what and who owed whom. To many people in these areas, he was just Lenny, a familiar face who always seemed to know a guy who could fix a problem, find a loan, arrange a bet, or smooth out trouble with a supplier. The fact that he almost never explained how he did these things was, to some, a feature rather than a flaw. Behind the scenes, his position in the Chicago outfit had steadily solidified. The Italian leadership above him had changed. Sam Giancana, once the flashy face of the outfit, had been sidelined, then murdered in 1975. Older bosses like Tony Accardo retreated from view but continued to exercise influence. New frontline leaders such as Joseph Ayapa and Jackie Cerrone emerged, but the underlying structure persisted. The outfit still depended on a network of trusted intermediaries to handle the practical work of collecting money and enforcing order. In that network, Leonard Patrick and his longtime associate Gus Alex were central figures. Alex based largely in the Loop and the city's political and business circles, and Patrick, rooted in the neighborhoods, complemented each other. Law enforcement documents from this period, including surveillance summaries and internal memoranda, routinely linked their names. Investigators came to see them as the outfit's primary extortion specialists, responsible for what some later described as the street tax, payments extracted from business owners in exchange for being left alone. According to later indictments and to Patrick's own testimony decades afterward, their reach extended across a wide range of enterprises: restaurants, bars, car dealerships, wholesalers, and small manufacturers, many of them with no direct connection to gambling at all. The mechanics of this system were deceptively simple. A business owner, often after some initial incident that demonstrated vulnerability, a vandalized storefront, a menacing phone call, an unexplained visit from men who made their point without quite stating it plainly, would be approached by someone connected to Patrick or Alex. The offer, framed as advice rather than coercion, was that if the owner made regular payments, problems would disappear. Police attention to minor code violations would slacken. Labor disputes would be steered elsewhere. No one would break windows or linger threateningly near the entrance. Those who accepted entered into an unspoken contract enforced by reputation and fear. Those who hesitated faced a difficult choice. They could go to the authorities and risk being labeled as informants in a city where word traveled quickly and not always accurately, or they could quietly pay and hope that the arrangement truly bought safety. For many, especially those who had families to support and mortgages to pay, the second option seemed the lesser of two evils. Extortion of this kind worked precisely because it rarely erupted into open, headline-grabbing violence. Instead, it was a low, constant pressure that bent people's decisions over time. During these years, Patrick's daily life followed a steady rhythm. He held quiet meetings in coffee shops, diners, and club back rooms. He drove through the city and its near suburbs making rounds. Those who met him in these contexts later described him not as a man who shouted or banged tables, but as one who listened, nodded, and then stated calmly what needed to happen next. He could be polite, even fatherly in his manner, but he left little doubt that failure to comply would bring consequences. The fact that he rarely had to describe those consequences explicitly was itself evidence of how deeply outfit power was understood. Federal and local law enforcement, meanwhile, were slowly learning to see the pattern beneath the surface. The Chicago Crime Commission and similar groups had long compiled lists of suspected racketeers, and Patrick's name appeared frequently in their bulletins. Now, with RICO and other new tools, federal strike forces were trying to build cases that could connect those names to specific, provable acts forming part of an ongoing criminal enterprise. Chicago became one of several cities where the Justice Department deployed specialized teams of prosecutors, FBI agents, and investigators from agencies like the IRS and Labor Department. These teams studied betting slips, traced bank deposits, and followed the flow of cash. They set up surveillance on known hangouts. They recorded license plates outside social clubs and noted who went in and out. They cultivated informants, gamblers who had been shortchanged, bookmakers squeezed too hard, low-level outfit associates angry about their cut. Some of these informants were willing to speak in exchange for leniency on their own charges. Others were motivated by personal grievances or fear. Gradually, they provided investigators with a clearer picture of Patrick's operations. The route he followed to pick up envelopes, the businesses he visited regularly, the people who came to him with problems. But turning that picture into courtroom evidence was another matter. Victims were hesitant to testify. Some had lived for years under the arrangement and feared what would happen if they named names in open court. Others believed, not without reason, that portions of local law enforcement were compromised, and that any complaint might find its way back to the very men they feared. As a result, many early efforts to pin concrete extortion charges on Patrick stalled. Prosecutors could show that he consorted with known outfit figures, that he had no visible legitimate source of income, and that his name arose repeatedly in conversations about collections. Yet they could not always tie him to specific threats or payments beyond a reasonable doubt. Patrick was acutely aware of this dynamic, and he adjusted accordingly. He minimized his use of telephones, preferring face-to-face conversations. When he did speak by phone, he chose his words carefully, avoiding anything that could be misinterpreted or used against him. In an era when electronic surveillance was becoming more sophisticated, this practice served him well. Wiretaps placed on the phones of associates might catch him arranging a meeting or exchanging pleasantries, but rarely anything more. He also cultivated an image of advanced age and frailty that, while not entirely false, was strategically useful. As he moved into his 60s, observers noted his white hair, his occasionally stooped posture. To some law enforcement officials watching him leave a coffee shop or step into a car, he looked more like a retired grandfather than an active racketeer. This did not fool the agents and prosecutors who had been following him for years, but it could influence jurors and judges, and it subtly shaped the way many people in his community perceived him. The danger he represented was not obvious at a glance. The wider context of Chicago in the 1970s added complexity to his story. The city was grappling with economic change, factories closing or relocating, rising unemployment in some neighborhoods, and debates over public housing and schools that often fell along racial lines. Political scandals and accusations of police misconduct eroded trust in institutions for many residents. In this atmosphere, some small business owners felt that they had little reliable support from official channels. To them, paying a man like Patrick for protection was distasteful, even frightening, but at least it produced predictable results. Licenses got processed. Trouble from other criminals decreased. In a narrow sense, the arrangement worked, and that made it harder for law enforcement to convince victims to help dismantle it. Patrick benefited from another pattern as well: the focus of many major federal investigations on the very top of the outfit, and on its involvement in union corruption and casino skimming. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a series of cases targeted Chicago bosses suspected of siphoning millions of dollars from Las Vegas casinos through back-channel arrangements with Teamsters pension funds and local union officials. These high-profile prosecutions drew considerable resources and public attention. Several leading outfit figures were convicted and sent to prison. Although these events affected Patrick indirectly, they strained the organization, provoked internal reshuffling, and heightened general scrutiny. They did not immediately place him in the dock. Instead, mid-level figures like Patrick often became more important as the outfit tried to maintain its income streams, while top bosses fought legal battles. The money generated by neighborhood-level extortion, loan sharking, and gambling became even more vital when large-scale ventures were disrupted. That meant that Patrick's role as collector and enforcer in northern districts remained secure. At the same time, the very visibility of those collections grew. The more critical each monthly envelope became to the outfit's financial stability, the more determined its leaders were to see that no one fell behind. According to later federal indictments and Patrick's own admissions, by the mid-1970s he and Gus Alex had established a durable system of payments from a roster of businesses that would stay on their books for well over a decade. The sums varied by victim and by year, but the structure, the expectation of regular cash in exchange for being left alone, remained consistent. If an owner considered stopping, there were reminders, sometimes in the form of blunt words, sometimes through incidents that underscored vulnerability without rising to the level of headline-making violence. On the law enforcement side, patience was the order of the day. Rather than bring a weak case and watch it collapse, federal prosecutors in Chicago's organized crime strike force opted to play a long game. They compiled records of unexplained cash deposits, documented unexplained damage to businesses that coincided with changes in payment patterns, and tried to persuade reluctant victims to tell their stories. In a few instances, owners did come forward, often only after moving away or selling their businesses, when they felt somewhat safer. Their accounts of quiet visits from men like Patrick, of the anxiety of pulling cash from a register each month to put into an envelope, of the grinding humiliation of having to smile and shake hands with someone they feared, added crucial detail to the investigative file. The accumulation of information was slow, but it was not static. Each new piece, a license plate from a surveillance report, a banking record obtained by subpoena, a partial transcript from a monitored conversation, fit into a larger mosaic. Agents began to see patterns in the dates of Patrick's meetings, the routes he drove, and the people he regularly visited. They logged instances when his appearances coincided with subsequent changes in a business's financial records, or with abrupt shifts in the behavior of employees who might have been involved in gambling or side deals. Even as this picture sharpened, Patrick continued his steady, outwardly uneventful routine. He aged into his 70s, still active in his corner of the outfit's world. In photographs from this period, he looks more like a pensioner than a predator. Glasses, thinning white hair, conservative clothing. But the substance of his work had not changed. He was still, as one federal agent later described him, the guy who went to see you when the outfit wanted something and didn't want to have to ask twice. His personal life remained largely out of the public eye. He was not known for lavish parties or conspicuous displays of wealth. Neighbors in the predominantly Jewish and middle-class areas where he spent much of his time saw him at grocery stores, at the occasional social gathering, sometimes at religious services on major holidays. He blended into a generation of older men who had built lives in Chicago's neighborhoods and suburbs, many of them retired from manufacturing jobs or small businesses. To most of them, if they thought about him at all, he was just another aging face. Yet he carried with him the accumulated weight of decades in organized crime. He knew which businesses had been paying tribute since the 1950s and which were newer additions. He knew which police officers could be trusted to look the other way and which could not. He knew how far he could push a reluctant debtor without provoking open defiance. The very ordinariness of his appearance was part of what made him such an effective representative of the outfit. He did not look like the caricature of a gangster, imagined by people who had seen too many movies, and that dissonance made it easier for him to move through the world without constant suspicion. By the early 1980s, though, the distance between appearance and reality was starting to narrow. The strike forces that had once focused on union corruption and casino skimming were turning more attention to the quiet extortion rackets that men like Patrick embodied. New generations of prosecutors, some of whom had grown up in Chicago watching their elders whisper about the outfit, were determined to dismantle the systems that had long seemed beyond the law's reach. They were willing to devote years to a single, complex case if they believed it could expose the structure of the enterprise. For Leonard "Lenny" Patrick, the habits and strategies that had preserved him for so long, measured speech, avoidance of phones, reliance on reputation over open threats, would soon collide with this new, more patient and better-armed approach. The extortion network he had helped manage for years was becoming not just a means of income, but the very evidence that federal prosecutors hoped to use to finally bring him and his closest associate, Gus Alex, fully into the courtroom spotlight. The decision he would eventually make, after his arrest, to cooperate with those prosecutors and testify against his own world still lay ahead. For now, he remained a key player in a system of quiet coercion that had shaped the lives of hundreds of ordinary Chicagoans, unaware that the records and memories of those same people were gradually being marshaled against him. By the beginning of the 1980s, the quiet routines that defined Leonard "Lenny" Patrick's life looked, from the outside, almost unremarkable. He was in his late 60s, moving into the age when many men retired from work altogether. He still drove the same basic routes through Chicago's North Side and near suburbs, still spent long stretches of time in modest coffee shops and neighborhood restaurants, still made his rounds of small businesses where owners greeted him with a mixture of politeness and caution. To a casual observer, he might have seemed like a semi-retired salesman with a long client list and an ingrained habit of checking in. The reality was very different. Each of those stops, each of those quiet conversations, was part of an extortion and gambling network that had been operating for decades. And while Patrick followed his well-worn path, men and women he rarely saw were filing reports, transcribing phone calls, and drafting legal strategies designed to bring that network down. The Chicago outfit had survived scandals, national hearings, and changes in leadership. It had adapted to new economic conditions and new neighborhoods, but it was now facing something it had never encountered in quite this way before: a sustained, methodical federal campaign built on laws and investigative techniques developed specifically to dismantle organizations like it. By this time, RICO was no longer a new idea. Prosecutors across the country had begun to use it against drug cartels, labor racketeering schemes, and traditional crime families. In Chicago, federal strike forces drew on lessons learned from earlier cases involving union funds and Las Vegas casinos. Those prosecutions had shown that the outfit could be hurt by dismantling the financial and logistical structures that supported its operations, even if the men at the top tried to stay far from any particular criminal act. The next logical step was to apply the same approach to the lower profile, yet very pervasive street-level rackets that had long been a backbone of outfit income. Patrick's operations, in partnership with Gus Alex, were prime targets. They sprawled across the city's northern districts and nearby suburbs, touching a cross-section of businesses: bars, restaurants, small factories, retail shops, and local service providers. Some of these places also hosted illegal gambling, others did not. What they had in common was that, according to later court documents and investigative records, Many of their owners made regular cash payments in exchange for being left alone. It was this steady, hidden flow of money that federal agents set out to trace. The mid-1980s were a pivotal period in that effort. The Justice Department's Organized Crime Strike Force in Chicago assigned agents to focus specifically on extortion on the North Side, where Patrick was most active. They pored over past police reports, many of which had gone nowhere at the time, looking for patterns. The same names recurring in different contexts, the same businesses mentioned in complaints over many years. They subpoenaed bank records to identify unusual deposits or cash withdrawals that might correspond to off-the-books payments. They cross-referenced license plate numbers gathered from surveillance outside suspected hangouts with known associates of the outfit. Technological advances, modest by later standards but significant at the time, helped. Miniaturized recording devices could capture conversations in restaurants. And cars with less risk of detection. Phone taps could be more selectively targeted. Agents, trained to be patient, would sit for hours in unmarked vehicles, watching the comings and goings at certain storefronts. Reports from that era describe Patrick's movements with clinical detail. The time he arrived at a location, how long he stayed, who else was seen entering or leaving. Informants played a crucial role as well. Some were small-time gamblers or bookmakers who had fallen afoul of outfit expectations and hoped cooperation would bring them leniency. Others were business owners who, after years of payments, had finally reached a breaking point. These individuals rarely came forward easily. Many were deeply afraid, not only of physical reprisal, but of social consequences in tightly knit communities where being labeled a rat could carry its own burden. Federal agents often had to meet them in out-of-the-way locations, reassure them repeatedly, and sometimes arrange for their relocation or extended protection. Despite the risks, a slowly growing number chose to talk. Their stories, though individual in detail, followed a consistent pattern. At some point, often after a minor incident that left them unsettled, they had been approached by a representative of the outfit. In many cases, that representative was Patrick himself. The tone of the conversation was almost always mild on the surface. There might be references to problems the business had been having, to unfortunate incidents that could recur. Then came the implicit solution. If the owner agreed to make a periodic cash payment, things would calm down. The precise sums varied, but the structure was the same. As these accounts accumulated, agents and prosecutors began to see Patrick not just as a name on old lists of known hoodlums, but as the central figure in a long-running extortion scheme that fits squarely within the scope of RICO. Each payment, each intimidating visit, each veiled threat could be seen as one act in a larger pattern stretching over many years, arguably decades. The challenge was to marshal enough of these acts into a coherent case that could withstand courtroom scrutiny. While the federal investigation deepened, Patrick's outer life changed relatively little. He aged visibly. His hair turned fully white, his gait slowed, but he continued to work. In photographs taken by surveillance teams in the late 1980s, he is shown in dimly lit restaurants at small tables with one or two companions. They lean in to speak. He listens, gestures occasionally. There are no dramatic scenes, no raised voices captured in those still images. Yet the agents who took them knew that behind these ordinary moments lay the substance of their case. The atmosphere in Chicago at large was also evolving. During the 1980s, a series of major investigations, most famously Operation Greylord, which uncovered extensive corruption in the Cook County court system, shook public confidence in local institutions, but also demonstrated that entrenched abuse of power could be exposed. Judges, lawyers, and court personnel were indicted and convicted. For some citizens, including a few of those long subjected to outfit pressure, these developments provided a glimmer of reassurance that the old, seemingly impenetrable structures of power could crack. It became slightly easier in that environment for federal agents to persuade reluctant witnesses that this time, perhaps, the system would protect them. By the close of the decade, the strike force believed it had enough. Quietly, without publicity, prosecutors drafted a sweeping indictment. It laid out a narrative of extortion and racketeering centered on a small group of men, among them Gus Alex and Leonard, Lenny, Patrick, who were accused of running a protection racket that had targeted businesses across Chicago's North Side and certain suburbs for many years. The charges drew on RICO extortion statutes, and in some instances, tax-related offenses stemming from undeclared cash. When the indictment was unsealed in 1990, the names listed were familiar to law enforcement but startling to many ordinary Chicagoans. Headlines emphasized that one of those charged, Leonard Patrick, had been involved in organized crime since the days of the Great Depression. At 76 or 77 years old, he was portrayed in press accounts as one of the longest-serving mob figures in the city's history. Journalists highlighted the arc of his life. An immigrant son who had drifted into crime as a young man, served time for serious offenses, and then embedded himself so deeply in the outfit's operations that he had become, as one article put it, a living thread connecting Capone's era to the present. The indictment itself outlined in careful, restrained language what investigators believed he had done. It described a racketeering enterprise that had used fear of economic harm and physical injury to compel payments from business owners. It alleged that this enterprise had functioned for at least 2 decades, and that Patrick and Alex had been key organizers and enforcers. It listed specific episodes where owners, sometimes named, sometimes identified by description, had allegedly been pressured to hand over cash. For each count, there were potential penalties measured in years or decades. Federal agents arrested Patrick without incident. There was no dramatic raid. Officers simply came to him with a warrant, and he was taken into custody. Photographs from that time show an elderly man in handcuffs, escorted by agents in suits. The visual contrast between his age and the gravity of the charges made an impression. Commentators noted that, if convicted on all counts and given maximum sentences, he could theoretically spend the rest of his life in prison. For Patrick, who had already served a long stretch behind bars in his youth, the prospect of returning to a cell in his late 70s was stark. The federal system in which he now found himself was different from the one he had known decades earlier. It had more structured sentencing guidelines, less tolerance for backroom leniency, and a much richer toolkit for supervising and debriefing defendants who chose to cooperate. Prosecutors made it clear that they were not simply interested in punishing him. They wanted to use his knowledge to expose the outfit's inner workings, particularly the role of his longtime associate, Gus Alex, and others who had managed various territories and schemes. The culture Patrick came from and had helped uphold for years had clear rules about such choices. Loyalty was paramount. Cooperation with law enforcement, turning rat, in the harsh language of the streets, was harshly condemned. Men who broke that code risked not only their own safety, but the well-being of anyone close to them. For decades, this unwritten law had been one of the most powerful protections organized crime possessed. It was the reason so few high-ranking mobsters had ever testified openly about their own activities. Yet by 1990, the code of silence was no longer quite as absolute as it had once been. In other cities, prominent mob figures had already broken ranks under the pressure of federal indictments and the threat of long sentences. In New York, government witnesses had helped convict powerful bosses. In Chicago itself, a handful of individuals connected to the outfit had chosen to cooperate in earlier cases. They were not celebrated by their former peers, but their existence showed that defection was no longer unthinkable. Patrick's lawyers understood this context. They met with federal prosecutors to discuss the charges, the evidence, and what a trial might look like. The government's case against him was not perfect. No complex case ever is, but it was substantial. They had multiple victims willing to testify, financial records, surveillance reports, and years of investigative work tying him to specific acts that formed part of a broader pattern. If he went to trial and lost, sentencing guidelines suggested he could face what would effectively be a life sentence. At some point in this period, over the course of confidential meetings, conversations with attorneys, and direct discussions with prosecutors, Patrick made a decision that would redefine his legacy. He agreed not only to plead guilty to certain charges, but to cooperate fully with the government's efforts to prosecute his former associates. This cooperation would not be symbolic. Prosecutors insisted that he tell them everything he knew about every phase of his life in organized crime, from his earliest robberies to his most recent collections. They wanted details: names, places, dates, methods, and relationships. One of the most dramatic aspects of his cooperation involved not just talking about past events, but actively helping to gather new evidence. Under close supervision from federal agents, Patrick agreed to wear a concealed recording device in meetings with Gus Alex and other suspected outfit figures. For a man of his age and history, this was an extraordinary step. He had spent his adult life avoiding microphones and cameras. Now he was turning himself into one. Agents prepared him carefully. They briefed him on how the devices worked when they would be turned on, where he should position himself to ensure conversations were recorded clearly. They rehearsed likely scenarios, what topics might arise, how he could guide the discussion in useful directions without seeming unnatural, how to respond if someone became suspicious. Every outing carried risk. If the device were discovered, the consequences could be severe. But both Patrick and his handlers believed that his age and long-established relationships made him less likely to be suspected. Many in the outfit's upper ranks simply did not imagine that a man like him, with his history and reputation, would ever help the government. The recordings Patrick made in this period became some of the most important pieces of evidence in the subsequent trials. In them, according to later court summaries and media accounts, Alex and others discussed ongoing extortion arrangements, commented on specific victims, and acknowledged the outfit's control over certain territories and rackets. The language was often guarded, full of euphemisms and unfinished sentences, but when combined with testimony from business owners and previous surveillance, it helped complete the picture prosecutors wanted to present to a jury. Patrick's debriefings with federal agents, conducted over many sessions, were exhaustive. He was asked to reconstruct, as best he could, the story of his life in crime, the Depression-era bank robbery that had first sent him to prison, the connections he had forged there, his early work with underworld figures on the West Side, his gradual ascent to a position of authority under outfit leaders, and the specific mechanics of the extortion schemes he had helped manage in later decades. Agents took notes, cross-checked his statements against other sources, and sometimes pressed him when his recollections were vague or incomplete. Cooperation did not erase his past, and both prosecutors and Patrick himself knew it. As part of his plea agreement, he admitted to acts that went far beyond financial crimes. In courtroom filings and under oath, he acknowledged that he had participated in or ordered serious violence at various points in his career, including killings. For the purposes of this documentary, and in keeping with responsible guidelines, it is enough to say that these admissions underscored the depth of his involvement in the outfit, and the harm the organization had inflicted on many people over many years. Patrick's willingness to speak about such matters was not an act of conscience in any simple sense. It was, at least in part, a calculated effort to satisfy prosecutors' demands in exchange for leniency. But whatever his motives, the result was that law enforcement gained an unusually detailed insider account of Chicago's underworld over half a century. News of his cooperation leaked out in fragments. Rumors spread through the outfit's circles and into the wider community. For many in Chicago, the idea that a figure as entrenched as Lenny Patrick had decided to testify against his own associates was almost unimaginable. Journalists seized on the story. Articles described him as the outfit's longest-serving soldier and emphasized the symbolic weight of his decision. If someone who had spent nearly his entire adult life in organized crime could break the code of silence, perhaps the old model of the invulnerable, closed-off mob was finally eroding. Inside the outfit, reactions were a mixture of anger, disbelief, and nervous calculation. Some refused, at least publicly, to accept that Patrick had turned. Others, confronted with growing evidence, including the detailed nature of federal charges and the emerging outline of the government's case against Alex, recognized that the damage was real and potentially far-reaching. Trust, already strained by earlier defections in other cities and by the constant pressure of law enforcement, became even more fragile. As 1991 turned into 1992, the stage was set for the public culmination of all this hidden work. The trial of Gus Alex, and several co-defendants, a proceeding in which Leonard Lenny Patrick would not be seated quietly at the defense table as he might once have expected, but would instead take the witness stand as the government's star witness. The man who had spent most of his life avoiding testimony, who had built his reputation on silence and discretion, was about to tell under oath, in open court, the story of his own crimes and those of the men he had served alongside for decades. The day Leonard Lenny Patrick walked into a federal courtroom in Chicago as a government witness, decades of whispers about the outfit's inner workings suddenly had a living, speaking source. He was in his late 70s, small-framed, with white hair and glasses, dressed much like any other elderly man summoned for jury duty or a minor civil matter. Yet the people in that room knew who he was and what he represented. For years, his name had appeared in investigative files, newspaper stories, and law enforcement summaries as a fixture of Chicago's underworld. Now he was taking a seat not at the defense table, but in the witness box, facing the very men he had once worked alongside. The case centered on Gus Alex, and several co-defendants, men federal prosecutors described as key figures in an extortion and racketeering scheme that had preyed on North Side businesses for years. At the heart of the indictment was the allegation that Alex and his associates had systematically imposed a street tax on a wide range of enterprises, using the outfit's reputation, and when necessary, targeted threats to compel regular cash payments. Patrick, long known in law enforcement circles as Alex's partner in these operations, had already pleaded guilty and agreed to cooperate. His testimony would be the spine of the government's story. Reporters who covered the trial later noted the almost unnerving contrast between the quiet tone of his voice and the seriousness of what he described. Under questioning from federal prosecutors, Patrick did not posture or grandstand. He spoke in straightforward, unadorned language, answering questions about events that stretched back to the 1930s. He acknowledged his age, his criminal past, and his role in the outfit. At one point, according to contemporary accounts, he summarized his life's work in a few flat words. He had been, for decades, a criminal in the service of Chicago's organized crime structure. The prosecution needed more than a confession. It needed structure. Over days of testimony, they walked Patrick through the chronology of his career. He confirmed the broad outlines of his early years in crime, the Depression-era robberies that led to his first long prison term, his reintegration into Chicago's underworld after release, and his gradual shift from direct violence and robberies into the more organized, business-like extortion and gambling rackets of the post-prohibition outfit. He explained how his Jewish background and West Side roots had made him a useful intermediary in communities where Italian bosses preferred to act through trusted associates rather than appear directly. From there, the questioning focused on the period most relevant to the charges against Alex and the others, the decades in which Patrick had helped run the outfit's extortion operations on the North Side and in nearby suburbs. He described, in broad strokes, how new customers were identified. Sometimes, he said, businesses came to the outfit's attention because they hosted gambling or attracted a clientele useful to bookmakers. In other cases, they were simply profitable enterprises in areas the outfit considered its own territory. In each instance, the underlying message was the same. If you wanted to operate without trouble, you paid. Patrick laid out the routine in a way that was both matter of fact and, for many listening, chilling in its mundanity. An owner might first experience some incident, an unexplained act of vandalism, a sudden uptick in scrutiny from city inspectors, rumors of other criminals targeting the business. Not long after, someone associated with the outfit would appear. Sometimes it was Patrick himself. The visitor would imply that the business had attracted attention and suggest that a regular payment could make the problems go away. Discussions rarely included direct, explicit threats, but the implication was clear to everyone involved. As Patrick explained it, the understanding was that the outfit could cause trouble or prevent it. The payments were for the latter. He outlined how these payments were structured, typically monthly or periodic envelopes of cash, the amounts tailored to the size of the business and its perceived ability to pay. He detailed the way he and others kept track of who owed what, how much slack they would allow a struggling owner, and what kinds of reminders would be used if someone fell behind. His descriptions matched what several business owners had already told investigators and, in some cases, the court. The visits that caused them sleepless nights, the sense of being trapped in an arrangement they had never wanted but felt powerless to escape. Prosecutors also used Patrick to connect these day-to-day practices to the higher-level organization of the outfit. He explained that he did not operate on his own authority. He reported to figures above him. Chief among them, he said, Gus Alex. Collections did not end with him. The cash moved up the chain, and with it reports on who was cooperating, who was resistant, and where new opportunities might lie. In this way, he helped the jury see the pattern federal law under RICO required. A sustained enterprise, not just isolated crimes. The government did not rely solely on his words. They introduced into evidence recordings Patrick had made while wearing a concealed device after he agreed to cooperate. Jurors heard snippets of conversations in which Alex and others discussed payments, referenced specific businesses, or spoke in guarded terms about taking care of situations. The language was often coded, as experienced criminals rarely spoke openly about illegal acts, but when combined with Patrick's explanations and the testimony of victims, it formed a coherent picture. For all of the prosecution's reliance on him, Patrick was a complicated witness. His life story contained more than extortion. Over the years, he had been involved in severe violence and in arranging killings. In keeping with responsible standards, court proceedings did not dwell on graphic details, but his own admissions made clear that he had participated in serious harm. Prosecutors did not try to hide this from the jury. Instead, they leaned into it, presenting his long record as both a reason to treat his statements carefully and as evidence of how much he knew about the outfit's true operations. The defense team seized on that history with vigor. Their cross-examinations focused less on disputing that Patrick had been a criminal and more on arguing that such a man could not be trusted as a truth-teller. They reminded the jury, repeatedly, that he had reached a deal with the government, a plea agreement that held out the promise of a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. They suggested that he had every reason to shape his story to please prosecutors, to exaggerate some aspects and minimize others. They walked him through past lies he had told police or prosecutors, times when he had denied involvement in crimes that he now freely admitted. If he had lied then, they asked in various ways, why should anyone believe him now? They painted him as a man trying to save himself at the end of a long, unlawful life by shifting blame onto others. They also questioned his memory, pointing out his age and the long span of time he was being asked to recount. Could he really, they implied, recall conversations and arrangements from years or decades before with the clarity the government suggested? Patrick, by most contemporary accounts, did not respond with theatrics. He acknowledged, again, that he had lied in the past to protect himself and his associates. He admitted he was cooperating now in the hope of leniency. When pressed on details he could not recall, he sometimes said plainly that he did not remember, rather than trying to invent specifics. This candor, limited as it was by the circumstances, was part of what prosecutors had counted on. They knew that jurors would be skeptical of a man like him. Their strategy was to present him not as a saint-turned whistleblower, but as a lifelong criminal finally telling the truth, because he had run out of other options. Crucially, a significant portion of his testimony was corroborated. Business owners he had named took the stand, and though often visibly nervous, confirmed his accounts of visits, payment schedules, and the unspoken understanding behind them. Bank records and financial analyses supported claims about the flow of money. The recordings he had made while wired provided, in the clipped, elliptical language of underworld conversation, support for his description of how he and Alex operated. The judge in the case, presiding over a proceeding watched closely by local media and law enforcement observers, instructed the jury carefully on how to treat testimony from accomplices and cooperating witnesses. Such evidence was to be weighed with caution, the judge emphasized, but it was not to be disregarded solely because it came from a criminal. Jurors were told to consider whether Patrick's statements were supported by independent evidence, and whether his admissions against his own interest gave them reason to believe he was, at last, being candid. After weeks of testimony, arguments, and jury deliberation, the verdicts came down. Gus Alex, and several co-defendants were convicted on key counts related to racketeering and extortion. For federal investigators and prosecutors who had spent years building the case, the result was a clear sign that their strategy, using RICO, electronic surveillance, and the testimony of insiders like Patrick, could penetrate systems that had once seemed untouchable. For the outfit, the convictions represented a major blow to a crucial part of its operations, removing from the field men who had long overseen profitable rackets with relatively little exposure. Sentencing followed. Alex, already in his 70s, received a substantial prison term, effectively a life sentence given his age, along with financial penalties. He would die in federal custody before completing his time. For Patrick, the outcome reflected the uncomfortable balance at the heart of modern organized crime prosecutions. His cooperation had been instrumental in securing the convictions. He had provided a rare, detailed insider view of outfit operations stretching across 5 decades. He had also, by his own account, been deeply involved in those same crimes, including acts that had cost people their lives or livelihoods. At his own sentencing, Patrick faced the court not as an unrepentant defendant still denying responsibility, but as a man who had admitted a great deal and helped the government. Prosecutors recommended leniency in recognition of his cooperation. The judge, weighing that against the seriousness of his crimes and the length of time he had spent in the underworld, imposed a prison term that was considerably shorter than those given to the men he had testified against, but still significant. Even with allowances for his age and health, he would spend years in custody. There was no celebration. By all accounts, Patrick accepted the sentence without visible emotion. At his age, any prison term carried the possibility that he might never again live outside a controlled environment. Yet compared with the potential sentence he had faced under the original, full set of charges, the deal he had made with the government clearly spared him the harshest outcome. Whether this weighed on him as relief, guilt, or some unspoken mixture of both is largely a matter of conjecture. He did not give extended public interviews or memoir-worthy reflections in which to lay out his inner life. Outside the courtroom, reactions to the case were layered. Many business owners who had lived for years under the shadow of outfit extortion felt a grim satisfaction. Some had testified, others had watched from a distance, knowing that men who had once walked into their shops with quiet, coercive authority were now themselves under the control of guards and wardens. For them, The convictions were not simply a legal outcome, but a symbolic reversal of power. Within the broader Chicago community, the trial and its outcome added another chapter to the city's long, troubled relationship with organized crime. Chicagoans had grown up with stories of gangsters, from the bloody Prohibition years through the more subdued, but no less corrosive decades that followed. The spectacle of a veteran mob figure like Patrick taking the stand against his old associate disrupted familiar narratives. It suggested that even in an organization that prided itself on loyalty and silence, individual self-preservation could, under enough pressure, trump long-standing codes. The Jewish community, in which Patrick had his roots and where he had operated for much of his career, also took notice. For years, community leaders had denounced organized crime and worried about the damage figures like Patrick did to public perceptions. His late-life cooperation did not erase that history, nor did it make him a hero in any conventional sense. But for some, there was a certain grim irony in the fact that a man who had played such a large role in sustaining the outfit's power over Jewish and other business owners was also, in the end, one of the people who helped federal authorities better understand and confront that power. For law enforcement, the Patrick Alex case became a reference point. In training sessions and conferences, investigators and prosecutors pointed to it as an example of how dogged financial work, patient cultivation of witnesses, and strategic use of cooperating insiders could make inroads into long-entrenched criminal networks. It reinforced the idea that, while spectacular raids and dramatic arrests made headlines, the real work of dismantling organized crime often involved quiet, incremental steps unfolding over many years. Patrick began serving his new sentence in a federal facility suited to his age and health status. He was no longer the young man who had first gone to prison in the 1930s, but the routines of confinement, counts, controlled movements, institutional food, the constant presence of guards, were familiar. Federal authorities continued to draw on his knowledge for a time, debriefing him further about aspects of outfit operations not fully explored at trial, asking about old cases, unsolved incidents, and the habits of men who were still under investigation. His cooperation placed him in an ambiguous position even behind bars. On the one hand, other inmates, especially those with some connection to organized crime, knew that he had testified against former associates, a label that traditionally marked someone as an outcast in that world. On the other hand, his age, the controlled environment of a federal facility, and the passage of time since the peak of his underworld influence created a buffer of sorts. There were no widely reported reprisals against him in prison, and federal officials had strong incentives to keep him safe as both a symbol and a practical source of information. Back in Chicago, the outfit adjusted to the loss of Alex and the exposure of its North Side extortion machine. New figures tried to fill old roles, but they did so in a city where law enforcement had a much clearer picture of how such systems worked. The psychological impact of Patrick's defection reverberated, too. For younger gangsters brought into the outfit in the 1980s and early 1990s, the image of an elder statesman of the mob testifying calmly in federal court was a cautionary reminder that the old assumptions about who would stay silent under pressure were no longer entirely reliable. As the years after the trial passed, Patrick's name gradually appeared less frequently in the news. Other cases, other scandals, and other figures captured public attention. He was, after all, a man who had come of age in the shadow of Prohibition. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the criminal landscape, the city, and even the media environment had changed dramatically from the world in which he had first picked up a gun and stepped into crime. Yet his story was not over. He still had years left to live, and those years, spent largely outside the public eye, but deeply shaped by the choices he had made and the bargain he had struck with the government, would form the final chapter of a life that traced, in its own stark way, the history of organized crime in Chicago across nearly the entire 20th century. When the trial was over and the sentences handed down, Leonard "Lenny" Patrick went back to a world he had known in a much different form half a century earlier: prison. This time there were no illusions about starting over afterward as a young man. He entered the federal system in his late 70s, his hair white, his body slowed by age, bearing not only the weight of years but the notoriety of having helped send down one of the outfit's key figures. Guards and administrators knew who he was. So did a fair number of inmates who followed organized crime news or had their own connections to that world. The conditions he faced were, by the standards of earlier decades, more regulated and medically attentive, but incarceration remained a strict, confining existence. He was housed in a federal facility suited to his age and health, where the population skewed older and included men with chronic conditions. The rhythms of daily life, roll calls, meal times, inspections, were rigidly fixed. For someone who had spent decades dictating others, schedules, setting the times of collections and meetings, this return to institutional routine must have been a sharp reversal, even if he did not show it outwardly. Inside, his status as a cooperator placed him in an ambiguous position. Traditionally, those who testified against their old associates were pariahs within criminal subcultures. But Patrick's circumstances were unusual. He was very old by prison standards, and he was held in a controlled federal environment where officials had a strong incentive to prevent harm to a man who had been so valuable as a witness. Whatever hostility might have existed among inmates familiar with his history did not result in widely reported confrontations. To most of the men around him, he was simply one more aging prisoner making his way through the last phase of a long sentence. Federal agents and prosecutors did not simply forget about him once he was behind bars. For some time after his sentencing, they continued to meet with him for debriefing sessions. In these interviews, often conducted in prison offices or visiting rooms, he was asked to go back over episodes from his past, to clarify details, to name names that still mattered to ongoing investigations. They would bring him reports or photos, asking if he recognized this person or that address, checking his recollections against their records. Sometimes he could fill in gaps about older cases, unsolved robberies, missing links in chains of extortion, the inner habits of bosses who had long since died or gone to prison themselves. From the standpoint of federal law enforcement, these sessions were part of a broader effort in the 1990s to preserve institutional memory about an organization that had thrived precisely because it kept so much hidden. Patrick, with underworld experience stretching back to the 1920s and 1930s, was a living archive. He could explain how certain territories had changed hands, why particular alliances had formed or broken, and how the outfit had managed to maintain influence in Chicago politics and business without always resorting to visible violence. While not every detail he provided could be independently verified, the overall contour of his account matched what investigators had assembled piece by piece from wiretaps, financial records, and other sources. Outside the walls, the world he had helped shape and exploit continued to change. The 1990s brought further federal pressure on the Chicago outfit. New cases targeted labor racketeering, gambling, and long unsolved murders. Agents and prosecutors who had learned from the Patrick, Alex prosecution refined their strategies. They focused on patterns rather than single incidents, used RICO to present the outfit as an integrated criminal enterprise, and pressed hard to flip insiders where possible. The idea that someone deeply embedded in the organization might one day cooperate, once unthinkable, had become a strategic assumption. The outfit, for its part, was shrinking. Many of the old guard bosses, men whose careers had paralleled Patrick's, were dying off or serving long federal sentences. Younger members, raised in a very different economic and social climate, did not enjoy the near-total neighborhood control their predecessors had. Legitimate entertainment options expanded, law enforcement tools grew more sophisticated, and the tolerance of the public and political class for open corruption declined, at least compared to the mid-20th century. Organized crime did not vanish from Chicago, far from it, but its role in the city's daily life gradually diminished from the pervasiveness it had once enjoyed. Against this backdrop, Patrick's own story moved into its final act. His cooperation, age, and health had weighed heavily in his sentencing, and they also influenced how long he ultimately remained behind bars. After serving a portion of his term, several years that effectively covered the first half of the 1990s, he was released from federal custody under supervised conditions. The exact arrangements were not publicized in detail. Authorities typically avoided drawing attention to the post-prison lives of high-profile government witnesses, both for their safety and to prevent unnecessary spectacle. What is clear is that the man who emerged from prison in his 80s was far removed from the young armed robber who had first gone in during the Depression, or the middle-aged extortionist who had spent decades walking into neighborhood businesses to collect envelopes of cash. His health was fragile. His circle of trusted associates, at least in the underworld sense, had been shattered by his own testimony and the passage of time. The outfit he had served was weaker than it had been in his prime, and the spaces where he had once operated, those north side and suburban storefronts and cafes, were increasingly unrecognizable, transformed by demographic shifts, redevelopment, and new commercial patterns. He spent his remaining years quietly. There were no public attempts at reinvention, no memoirs or television interviews in which he tried to recast himself as a repentant figure or a celebrity criminal. If he reflected deeply on his past, he did so in private. People who encountered him in these final years saw an elderly man, not obviously different from thousands of others in the Chicago area who had worked all their lives and now lived on fixed incomes and memories. Only those familiar with the deeper story of the city's underworld would have recognized him as one of its most enduring participants. This quiet end stood in sharp contrast to the sensationalized image of organized crime that had long dominated American popular culture. Films and television shows about mobsters often dwelt on dramatic confrontations, glamorous excess, and stylized violence. The reality of Patrick's late life, doctor's appointments, modest meals, the slow erosion of physical strength, was far more prosaic. He had spent decades enforcing influence through the threat of harm, yet his own final years were shaped more by the ordinary frailties of age than by high drama. For historians and criminologists, however, his life remained an object of serious interest. It provided an unusually long-term case study of how an individual could move through nearly every phase of 20th century organized crime in a single American city. As a teenager, he had watched the Prohibition-era gang wars from the streets of the West Side. As a young man, he had participated in violent robberies and gone to prison for it. As a middle-aged operator, he had become part of the outfit's effort to transform itself into a quieter, more business-like entity focused on gambling, extortion, and control of unions and legitimate enterprises. In old age, he had seen the legal system adapt and harden around him, eventually turning tools like RICO and witness cooperation back against the very networks that had once seemed untouchable. His trajectory also highlighted the complex role of ethnicity and community in Chicago's criminal history. Born into a family of Ukrainian Jewish immigrants in a working-class neighborhood, he grew up in a world where ethnic identity was both a source of solidarity and a barrier. The city's rigidly defined neighborhoods, patterns of discrimination, and informal boundaries of belonging helped shape his early experiences. Later, those same factors made him useful to an Italian-dominated outfit that needed trusted intermediaries to manage relationships in Jewish and other non-Italian communities. Yet if his background opened certain doors, it did not predetermine his choices. Many of his peers, other Jewish boys who grew up in the same tenements and walked the same streets, took very different paths into professions, trades, public service, or small business. For them, the same hardships of poverty and discrimination did not lead into organized crime. In that sense, Patrick's story is also a reminder that structural forces and personal decisions intertwine, but do not wholly define one another. His early life circumstances help explain, but cannot excuse, the path he chose. The moral tangle of his cooperation in later life is equally difficult to simplify. On one hand, his willingness to testify broke an entrenched code of silence and allowed federal authorities to bring to justice men who had long profited from fear and coercion. Many of the business owners who had lived under the outfit's street tax experienced his testimony as a belated form of accountability, a way of exposing practices they had been powerless to resist for years. In this light, his decision to work with the government weakened a system that had done real harm to countless people and businesses. On the other hand, his cooperation came only under extreme pressure when he faced the prospect of spending his remaining years in prison. For decades before that, he had actively maintained the very rackets he later described to prosecutors and juries. The suffering and anxiety experienced by victims during those years were not undone by his late life candor. From a strictly ethical perspective, his collaboration with law enforcement cannot erase or redeem the long period in which he enjoyed the benefits of organized crime and enforced its rules. What it does reveal, though, is how the balance of power between the state and organized crime shifted over time. When Patrick first entered the underworld, in the late 1920s and early 1930s, the idea that federal law enforcement could methodically gather evidence across decades and present it as part of a unified case was unthinkable. Local corruption, limited communication and record keeping, and a narrow legal framework made it relatively easy for well-connected criminals to avoid serious consequences. By the time he faced his final indictment in 1990, that world was gone. The state had developed a memory, a capacity to connect the dots across cases, years, and jurisdictions that transformed long-standing habits of impunity into liabilities. In the early 2000s, as Patrick lived out his last years, Chicago saw the culmination of another major federal case against the outfit, often referred to as the Family Secrets Trial. That prosecution, which drew on the testimony of another high-level cooperator and extensive investigative work, resulted in convictions for multiple murders and racketeering acts stretching back to the 1960s. Patrick was not a central figure in that case. By then his active role in the underworld was long over. But the methods used, RICO charges, reliance on insider witnesses, patient accumulation of evidence over decades, echoed the approach refined in the case in which he had testified. In this sense, his cooperation was part of a broader pattern in which aging mobsters, faced with long sentences and an increasingly capable federal system, chose to break with old codes. These choices did not end organized crime in Chicago or elsewhere, but they did undermine some of its most important advantages: secrecy, solidarity, and the belief among its members that the law could never fully penetrate their world. Younger criminals watching those developments had to reckon with a new reality in which even deeply embedded figures might one day sit in a courtroom and describe, in detail, the very operations they had once sworn to protect. Leonard "Lenny" Patrick died in the mid-2000s in his early 90s, after a long life that had begun in the crowded immigrant neighborhoods of early 20th century Chicago and ended in a very different city. The obituaries that marked his passing tended to emphasize the sweep of his lifespan. Journalists called him one of the last links between the era of Al Capone and the modern outfit, a man whose career had mirrored the evolution of organized crime itself. They noted his decision to cooperate with federal authorities, his role in bringing down Gus Alex, and his significance as a rare, long-serving insider who had publicly recounted the workings of the Chicago underworld. For all the attention given to his persona, what arguably matters more is what his story reveals about the structures around him. His life illustrated how organized crime could embed itself in a city's economic and social fabric, feeding on small vulnerabilities and larger injustices. It showed how, for many years, official indifference or corruption allowed that system to flourish. And it demonstrated, in its final act, how a combination of legal innovation, determined investigation, and the compromised testimony of insiders could begin to unwind a network that once seemed permanent. In his early years, he had been one among many poor children in a city bursting with newcomers, navigating crowded streets and limited options. By middle age, he was an established figure in a powerful criminal organization, moving money and exerting influence over hundreds of lives with a few quiet conversations each month. In old age, he was both a symbol of the outfit's reach and a tool in its undoing. The same man who had spent decades collecting envelopes of protection money ended his public career discussing those collections under oath, in a courtroom where the power structure was very different from the back rooms he had once ruled. The questions his story raises, about responsibility, opportunity, loyalty, and the capacity for late-life change, do not admit easy answers. They are, in many ways, the questions at the heart of any serious look at organized crime and its place in American history. As he left the stage, Lenny Patrick did so not as a cautionary tale neatly resolved, but as a complicated figure whose long, often destructive life nonetheless helped illuminate systems and patterns that might otherwise have remained in the shadows. Seen from the distance of the present, the life of Lenny Patrick reads almost like a compressed history of organized crime in 20th century Chicago. It begins in the crowded immigrant tenements of the West Side, in a city still struggling to absorb waves of newcomers and define its boundaries. It passes through the violence and improvisation of the Prohibition and Depression years, through the quieter consolidation of power in the post-war era, into the more bureaucratic, financially intricate operations of the late 20th century. It ends not in a blaze of violence or a dramatic escape, but in an elderly man's measured testimony and a quiet passing far from the spotlight. Understanding that trajectory in detail depends on sources that are, in many ways, the opposite of the mythic stories that long surrounded gangsters in public imagination. Patrick left no autobiography, no extensive on-the-record interviews. Much of what we know about him comes from the dry but revealing materials of the modern state: FBI files, court transcripts, plea agreements, sentencing memoranda, and the internal reports of organizations like the Chicago Crime Commission. These documents, pieced together, give us a picture of a man whose name appeared again and again, in connection with gambling, extortion, and association with known outfit figures. The most direct window into his mind and memory appears decades into the story, when he sat down with federal agents and prosecutors as a cooperating witness. In those debriefings, and later under oath in open court, he spoke about his past in a way that few of his contemporaries ever did. But this source is double-edged. He was speaking under pressure, with every incentive to satisfy prosecutors and secure leniency for himself. Historians and investigators who later reviewed his statements have had to weigh them carefully, comparing them against independent records and the accounts of others. Where his testimony can be checked, it often holds up. Names he provided match up with surveillance logs and earlier investigative notes. His broad description of extortion practices on the North Side fits the pattern described by multiple business owners, many of whom had never met each other and had no reason to collude. The structure he outlined: mid-level figures like himself and Gus Alex managing collections at the neighborhood level, relaying cash and information upward to more insulated bosses, matches what has been observed in other cities and other crime families. in areas where memories are necessarily hazier. Who said what, in which restaurant, on which particular afternoon 30 or 40 years earlier. He is less reliable, as any person would be. But taken as a whole, his account has become one of the central pieces of the historical record for this shadowed part of Chicago's past. His story is not only about one man's decisions, it is also about how ethnicity and community intersected with organized crime in mid-century America. Patrick was part of a generation of Jewish Americans whose parents or grandparents had fled Eastern Europe and settled in urban enclaves. In Chicago, Jewish neighborhoods on the West Side and later the North Side were vibrant, diverse places. They produced labor leaders, scholars, professionals, shopkeepers, artists, and in a relatively small number of cases, figures like Patrick who gravitated to the underworld. Chicago's Italian-dominated outfit quickly recognized the value of intermediaries from other backgrounds. In heavily Jewish or mixed neighborhoods, a non-Italian face could open doors, ease conversations, and make certain demands feel, if not welcome, at least less alien. Patrick occupied exactly that role. He knew the language, the habits, the rhythms of those communities because they were his own. When he walked into a delicatessen or a small factory to talk about problems and arrangements, he was not an outsider parachuting in from another world. He was someone whose childhood streets overlapped with those of the people he was pressuring. For mainstream Jewish organizations, his existence, and that of a few other Jewish American gangsters in Chicago and elsewhere, was a source of deep discomfort. At precisely the time when they were working hardest to combat anti-Semitic stereotypes about hidden influence and financial manipulation, here was a highly visible example of someone who, in fact, used connections and intimidation for illicit gain. Leaders of synagogues, civic groups, and anti-defamation organizations spoke out against organized crime and emphasized that such figures were statistical outliers, not representatives of their community. They were correct. The overwhelming majority of Jewish Chicagoans at mid-century lived conventional lives and had no truck with the outfit. Yet the damage Patrick and his peers did, both to specific victims and to broader perceptions, was real. The harm he helped inflict was, for the most part, deliberately kept out of sight. Extortion does not usually announce itself with sirens and front-page headlines. It manifests as a subtle but unrelenting pressure that seeps into everyday life. Business owners who later testified about dealing with Patrick rarely described spectacular episodes. Instead, they spoke of uncomfortable conversations, the dread of seeing him or his men walk through the door each month, the agonizing calculations they made as they pulled cash from the till or from personal savings to fill an envelope knowing that failure to do so might invite retaliation. Economically, these payments functioned like a private, unlawful tax. They reduced owners' ability to reinvest in their businesses, to hire more staff, or simply to save for their families' futures. Psychologically, they fostered a climate of fear and resignation. Some victims began to view the outfit as just another, if harsher, part of the cost of doing business in Chicago, no more avoidable than rent or utility bills. This normalization of coercion is one of the most insidious aspects of organized crime's influence. It shifts what people consider acceptable, narrowing their sense of what normal civic life can be. The Patrick Alex extortion network was just one strand in a much larger web. The Chicago outfit's reach extended into labor unions, construction and trucking firms, waste disposal, nightclubs, and, at times, city contracting and zoning decisions. It did not control every corner of municipal life. That notion is as much myth as reality, but it had enough points of leverage that those who crossed it had to proceed carefully. In some cases, outfit muscle aligned with elements of the city's political machine, creating mutually beneficial arrangements that traded jobs, votes, and favorable rulings for peace and profit. In other instances, the two spheres coexisted uneasily, each wary of provoking the other too openly. Patrick's importance in this broader structure lay precisely in his mid-level position. He was not at the top, cutting deals about Las Vegas casinos or long-term union strategies. Nor was he a low-level soldier carrying out day-to-day errands without seeing the whole picture. He operated at the point where organized crime touched ordinary life, on bar stools, in back offices, at small tables in family-run restaurants. Decisions he made about how hard to push a reluctant payer, whom to threaten, whom to leave alone, had an immediate, concrete impact on the lives of people who did not see themselves as part of any grand underworld story. Law enforcement's long struggle with him and his peers underscores the challenges democratic societies face when confronting such embedded criminal systems. For many years, prosecutors and police operated with tools ill-suited to the task. They could arrest bookmakers or raiders in a gambling den, but they struggled to prove the existence of an overarching enterprise. Corruption at various levels complicated their work. Witnesses feared not just physical reprisals, but the possibility that confidential complaints would find their way back to the very people they were meant to expose. The eventual shift, embodied in laws like RICO and in the creation of specialized organized crime strike forces, came with its own set of compromises. To dismantle entrenched networks, authorities increasingly relied on the testimony of insiders, people who had taken part in the very crimes being prosecuted. Leonard Patrick's cooperation is a textbook example. Without his willingness to describe in court the mechanics of extortion and the roles played by figures like Gus Alex, it is unlikely that the government's case would have been as strong. Yet the price of that testimony was a degree of leniency for someone who had, by his own admission, inflicted serious harm over many years. This trade-off remains controversial. Some argue that using criminals as witnesses undermines the moral authority of the justice system, allowing deeply culpable individuals to escape full punishment. Others contend that, without such cooperation, many sophisticated criminal organizations would remain effectively immune from prosecution. The story of Patrick's late-life cooperation does not resolve this debate, but it illustrates its stakes. The state, facing a formidable adversary, chose to enlist one of its oldest servants as a guide, granting him a measure of mercy in return. Whether that balance was correct is a question that continues to animate discussions of organized crime policy. His life also strips away certain comforting myths about crime and punishment. Pop culture depictions often divide the world into clear categories: glamorous villains, noble lawmen, cinematic showdowns. The reality embodied in Patrick's experiences is murkier. He was neither a mastermind nor a mere pawn. He was an opportunist shaped by his environment and his own decisions, a man who blended into his surroundings even as he distorted them for profit. The operations he ran were not theatrical. They involved ledgers, calendars, quiet meetings, and the steady application of fear. When the reckoning came, it did not take the form of a dramatic last stand, but of negotiated plea agreements, careful courtroom questioning, and years in institutional settings that bore little resemblance to the imagined world of gangster legend. For Chicago, his story is part of a larger reckoning with the city's past. The same decades that saw him rise through the outfit also witnessed the building of expressways, the transformation of neighborhoods through white flight and urban renewal, the struggles over school desegregation and public housing, and the machine politics of the Daily Era. Organized crime was not the only, or even the primary, force shaping those outcomes, but it was woven into the fabric of city life in ways that affected who got contracts, which bars thrived, how unions behaved, and what risks small entrepreneurs faced when they opened their doors. In the end, Lenny Patrick leaves behind no simple lesson. His life does not offer a neat arc of sin and redemption, nor does it support easy claims that poverty or discrimination inevitably produce criminals. Many people grew up in circumstances like his and chose very different paths. What his story does offer is a detailed case study of how one individual, over many decades, navigated and reinforced a system that profited from coercion, and how that system was eventually challenged by a state that had learned, sometimes painfully, how to remember, record, and connect. The image that opened this narrative, a frail old man on the witness stand, recalling the deeds of his youth and middle age, is in some ways the most fitting emblem of his legacy. It brings together the competing elements that defined his existence: the hard, unsentimental calculus of self-preservation, the deep, accumulated knowledge of an illicit world, the irreversible damage done to others along the way, and the belated exposure of a hidden order that had long shaped life in Chicago's neighborhoods. When he died in 2006, the city did not pause in grand collective reflection. Trains still ran, new buildings went up, businesses opened and closed, and a younger generation, for whom names like Capone and Gincana were already half mythical, went about their lives. Yet in the archives of federal courthouses, in the memories of those who lived under the street tax, and in the internal histories of law enforcement agencies, his story endures. It endures not because it is heroic in any conventional sense, but because it illuminates the mechanics of power and fear at a level of detail that is rarely captured so fully. In tracing his path, from a boy in a West Side tenement to an aging witness describing under oath the very machinery he once helped oil, we glimpse the long arc of organized crime in Chicago, its origins in economic scarcity and political neglect, its entanglement with legitimate institutions, its corrosive impact on communities, and the slow, imperfect, but ultimately significant efforts to confront it. Leonard "Lenny" Patrick was both a product and a shaper of that history. To study his life is to confront the uncomfortable fact that much of what we call the mob is not distant or exotic, but deeply ordinary, a set of calculated choices made in coffee shops and back rooms by people who look, at a glance, like anyone else, yet leave deep marks on the cities they call home.